Anyway, now let's get started with Judges. And this, I realized that this whole story we've been doing, we just started it actually, the whole story of Deborah, chapters 4 and 5. We will not finish it today. It is, I know I'm spending more time on these chapters than usual, but it's not just that it's a great story and that Deborah is such an important figure, actually a heroine in my mind, a very important person and leader in this book of Judges. But also there's so much here. If you're paying attention to the text, and you know, these are some of the things I want to really point out, not just to discuss the story, but there is so much richness in these two chapters. So that's why we're going to be taking a little bit longer on it. Okay, so last week we talked a bit about Deborah and her what we can learn about who Deborah was. We talked a bit about Sisera and who he was and what was going on at the time. What was the military balance of power, so to speak. Now I want to point out something. We're going to do different verses and point them out as we go along. So if we are now on chapter 4, and you remember the interchange between Deborah and Barak, and so if we look at verse 6, chapter 4, verse 6, this is when, of course, she gives the instruction to Barak, telling him, you know, he's got to go to war and exactly what he needs to do. And she says to him as follows, verse 6, Barak summoned Abinoam of Kedesh and Naphtali and said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, go march up to Mount Tabor and take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun. Now, here initially her instruction is to call upon people from two tribes, okay? Okay, why am I? Okay, and I'm going to go back to our favorite map that we always like to look at. And you can see why it makes sense that she's initially looking at Zebulun and Naphtali. So here's Zebulun here, and here's Naphtali. And you remember, first of all, Barak himself is up here in Kadesh. Okay, he lives in Naphtali. He's from the tribe of Naphtali, and he lives up here. And she's saying to him, go down to Mount Tabor, which is right over here, and pull Sisera and his men up from this area. Okay, so clearly the area that is most affected both by the fact that Barak himself is from Naphtali, and then they're coming down this way. Naphtali and Zebulun are clearly the natural first tribes that he's going to be calling upon. What we will see, though, as we continue, is that there will be, number one, other tribes that join, and number two, tribes that do not join. So I want to jump now to we're going to be jumping back and forth between chapter 4, which tells the story, and chapter 5, which is Deborah's song, where we get, of course, her perspective. She's singing a song of praise to God. She also includes in that song quite a bit of commentary that makes it that kind of fills in the story, extra information. Somebody's making noise, so if I could ask all of you to make sure you're muted, because we are hearing somebody's noise. Okay, so let's look now in chapter 5, and in first of all, in verses 2 and 9. In these verses, she praises those who have volunteered. Okay, so we have in verse 2, when, I don't know, I have a very weird translation here, so I'm going to do my own translation here. At a time of great troubles in Israel, when the nation volunteered, praise God. Okay, so she's referring here already to people in the nation who volunteer. Now, you'll remember that we called Naphtali and Zebulun, but here she's praising volunteers, and we'll learn later who these volunteers are. Again, in verse 9, she talks about volunteers. Here she says, my heart is with Israel's leaders, with the those who have volunteered from the nation. And again, my English has a different word for the word volunteer. The word in Hebrew volunteer is mitnadvim. I have two different translations of it here. Trust me, it means volunteers, okay? And those who volunteered from the nation, praise God. So we have twice then this this discussion or this praising of the volunteers. And then starting in verse 14, we start to find out exactly who were the volunteers and who weren't. So in 14, we have from Ephraim came. Now, this is also very interesting. Here we learn that Ephraim, its roots, it says, of Amalek or in Amalek. And literally, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense because there's no familial connection between Amalek and Ephraim. But if you look at it in the Hebrew, you can see, and this is one of the commentaries, Rashi, who interprets it this way, which makes a lot more sense. He talks about Ephraim, whose roots whose roots encountered, or whose roots were over Amalek, and it's referring to, of course, Joshua. Joshua, who, when the nation of Israel, children of Israel, first leave Egypt, the first nation that attacks them in the desert is Amalek. And who is the one who is the chief of staff, the military leader who leads the nation of Israel into battle with Amalek? Of course, it is Joshua. Joshua, who comes from the tribe of Ephraim. So here, and this makes, of course, a lot of sense, it is reminding us of Ephraim, who already is in his ancestors, and we're not talking about so long ago. Joshua was really just, one or two generations before. Joshua, whose sources already show that they had been victorious over Amalek. Afterwards, your kin Benjamin, okay? From Machir. Machir is from, do you remember? Machir is from Menashe. Now, if you look at this map, we will see that Menashe is actually split. There's Menashe on the eastern side and Menashe on the western side. Machir is on the western side, and that will become significant. From Machir came down leaders. From Zebulun, such as hold the marshal's staff, and that's over here, we already talked about. They were actually called to battle. And Issachar chiefs were with Deborah. Now we can see here, Issachar is right here, right next to Zebulun and Naphtali, so it makes a whole lot of sense that they're there. As Barak, so was Issachar rushing after him into the valley. So we have here these tribes. We have Ephraim, Benjamin, Menashe, Zebulun, and Issachar all being very involved in being the volunteers. Okay, maybe Naphtali and Zebulun have been drafted, the rest are the volunteers. Okay, and then we get a whole different group of people. Among the clans of Reuben were great decisions of heart. Why then did you stay among the sheepfolds and listen as they piped for the flocks? Among the clans of Reuben were great searchings of heart. We have two very similar expressions here, decisions of heart and searchings of heart. And what she's actually doing is mocking Reuben. And she's painting a picture. She's saying, you're sitting there busy with your sheep. Now, remember, who is Reuben? And this applies to God as well. Who were Reuben and God? These were the two tribes that came to Moses at the end of the book of Numbers, very close to, they're about to go into the land of Israel. They have just conquered the eastern part of the Jordan River from the Amorites and the Bashan, etc. They've just conquered that land. And Reuben and Gad say, you know what? We have so many flocks. We have so many sheep. Can we stay here? And initially, Moses sees this critically. He's concerned that what they're trying to do is get out of fighting. And then he says, then they say, no, we have no interest in getting out of fighting. And in fact, they say, we will be the forward team. We're going to not only join the fight, but we're going to be the advance guard. Okay, we're going to play a very vital role. And again, in the book of Joshua, in the beginning, Joshua confronts these tribes again and reminds them of their promise, and they convince him. And indeed, throughout the book of Joshua, Reuben and Gad are there as the forward guard, very much participating in the battles. But here we have Deborah reminds us of who Reuben and Gad were. These were the shepherds. And in a way, it echoes Moses's initial fear. It seems that their energies and their dedication, which they expressed under Joshua once they finished the original conquest, went back to their land, territory on the eastern side of the Jordan River, they feel a little less connected. Okay. Now we remember also at the end of Joshua, there is that crisis situation where these tribes, as well as the half tribe of Manasseh, build what is initially interpreted as an altar. And Joshua is very concerned. Are they trying to separate themselves? Are they going to build a rival altar, rival to Shiloh? And then they assure the nation that no, they are just trying to connect better. It is not an altar. It is merely a monument that will help them connect to Shiloh. But what you can see all along is that there's this tension, a tension starting with Moses going through Joshua, and we're seeing it here again. Are the people on the eastern side of the Jordan connected to the rest of Israel? And here we see Deborah bringing tremendous criticism to Reuben for being so concerned with their sheep. Listen as they pipe for the flocks. That's all they're doing. And she's mocking them with talking about great decisions of the heart, great searchings of the heart, as if they're sitting there and she's saying, yeah, I know you were thinking so much about what you were doing. You were really soul searching about whether you should join us. And of course, she's mocking them because at the same time, she's talking about how they're listening for the pipe of the flocks. Instead of listening for the drumbeats of war and joining your nation in arms, you sat by and were just listening to the pipe for the flocks. Okay, so she has tremendous criticism for Reuben. And then she continues, Gilead tarried beyond the Jordan. Now, who's Gilead? Gilead, the mountains of Gilead and the family of Gilead is the part of Manasseh that's on the eastern part of the Jordan. So we talked about Reuben, we talked about Manasseh, and then she skips across and she talks about Dan. And Dan, why did he linger by the ships? So Dan is down here, okay? Well, now we know Ephraim went, Manasseh went on this side, Zebulun, Issachar, Naphtali. What was Dan? Why was he? Didn't go, okay? He lingered by the ships. He's here at the coast. She makes fun of them again. You're so busy looking out for the ships that you can't bother to join your brothers. Asher up here, also along the coast. Asher remained at the seacoast and tarried at his landings. And then she goes back and praises the two main tribes. Zebulun is a people that mocked at death. Naphtali on the open heights. Then the kings came, they fought. So we can see very clearly how she is disparaging those people who did not join the party or did not join the fight, and how she is praising those who did. And so it's a very important message here about, not just a question of who wins the battle, but who's supporting it, Why, there's a lesson here about the need for unity and solidarity with one another. Okay, so let's go back now to chapter 4 and we'll move on. Okay, here we go, chapter 4. Now let's move on to verse 11. Okay, now Heber of the Kenite, separated from the other Kenites, descendants of Chobav, father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent at Elon Bitzananim, which is near Kadesh. Okay. And of course, this is going to take us into the whole story of Yael. And we'll read that in a minute. But who is Yael? Let's just we'll read this section here. We'll read the whole story, and then we're going to go back and we're going to try to figure out who is Yael. Sisera was informed that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. So Sisera ordered all his chariots, 900 iron chariots, and all the troops he had to move from Charosh HaGoyim to the Wadi Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, up, this is the day in which the Lord will deliver Sisera into your hands. The Lord is marching before you. Barak charged down Mount Tabor, followed by the 10,000 men, and the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and army into a panic before the onslaught of Barak. Sisera leaped from his chariot and fled on foot. as Barak pursued the chariots and the soldiers as far as Charoshet Agoyim, all of Sisera's soldiers fell by the sword, not a man was left. So first of all, here, it is not clear exactly what happened. We know it says here, the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and army into a panic. But in this chapter, we don't know what caused that panic, what happened. And of course, we do learn about that in the song in chapter 5, and she makes it very clear. Where are we? Here we go. Here we go. Right after here we go, starting from 19. Then the kings came, chapter 5, verse 19. Then the kings came, they fought, the kings of Canaan fought at Tanakh by Megiddo's waters. Okay? They got no spoil of silver. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses, they fought against Sisera. The torrent Kishon swept them away. The raging torrent, the torrent Kishon, march on my soul with courage. Then the horses' hoofs pounded as headlong galloped the steeds. Curse my road, said the angel of the Lord. Bitterly cursed its inhabitants because they came not to aid of the Lord, to the aid of the Lord among the warriors. Okay, what actually happened? As I mentioned, I believe last week, the Kishon is a wadi, or a nachal, as we call that in Hebrew, and that's very, very typical here in Israel, where you have a river that is usually dry. And the only time it becomes a real river is when there's a torrent of rain that suddenly what was a dry, looked like a riverbed, suddenly becomes full of rain. And so what we learn here in her song, which we don't have the details of in chapter 4, in her song, she basically is saying, Barak has lured the army into the Kishon, which at that point is a dry riverbed. The mud isn't muddy. It's totally dry. It's an easy way. It's kind of like, just on the contrary, when these things are dry, they become easy avenues of transportation. Okay, so he lures them into that. And then, of course, comes the miracle. Just at that moment when the entire army is sitting in this Kishon, the heavens open, torrential rains come, and then of course creates the mud that mires the entire army with all their chariots in the mud. And then this, because they're stuck, it makes it that much easier then for Barak and his army to come down. They are not in chariots. Now, what we discussed initially as a major deficit in chapter 4, verse 3, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, for he had 900 iron chariots. Okay, the chariots are the mark of power of Sisera. All of a sudden, the chariots become his downfall, because the Israelites don't have chariots, they don't have horses, they're running on foot. And if you're running on foot, it's much easier to negotiate a river of mud. You're not going to get stuck. You know how to do this. You're not like a horse or a chariot. But if you bring your chariots, you're going to get stuck, which of course made them pray for the Israelites who came in and decimated the entire army. So we have that story here as well. Okay, now we're going to move on, because what happens afterwards? Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Yael, wife of Heber the Kenite. For there was friendship between King Yavin of Chatzor and the family of Heber the Kenite. So it's very interesting. This story begins with verse 11 with a little bit of an introduction. Who is Heber the Kenite? What's he doing here? Okay. And then we continue that story here in verse 17 when we're going to meet Yael, who is the wife of Heber, and she, of course, is going to play a very, very important role. And this, by the way, is a very, very important sentence here. For there was friendship between King Yavin of Chatzor and the family of Heber the Kenite. Okay, so picture this. Okay, we have the King Yavin of Canaan and Sisera, his mercenary army, on one side, enemies of Israel on the other side. And then we have this Heber HaKenite, where we learn in verse 11 that he was the father-in-law of Moses, and he's living right there next to Naphtali. He's at Kadesh. He's living there very peacefully. And yet we learn in verse 17 that they also get along with the Canaanites, with Yavin. If you ask me to characterize who is this Heber, it's a tribe. The Kenite is a tribe. Heber is one of the people. It's a tribe. It is the tribe of Jethro. And you'll see in the Bible, even in Exodus, there's different names for Jethro. He was also called Reuel, and another point he's called Hever. Hever is probably Jethro's son. He's probably Tzipporah's brother, okay? This may be a different generation, Hever or Chovav. It says it's Hever, and he's from the Chovav. These are different names that show up in the family of Jethro. But this is who we're talking about. Clearly, this is, Moses' father-in-law is Jethro, okay? So Chovav is seen to be a synonym for Jethro. It's another name, but we see other names as well. And so Hever is part of that family. So what do we know about the Kenites, this Hever and his family? They're Switzerland. They're Switzerland. They get along with everybody, and they try very hard not to take sides. They are going to be friendly with Israel, but they're also going to be friendly with the Canaanites, okay? And I want to, before we get to the story of what actually Yael does, I want to follow through what we know about this Kenite family from other places in the Bible. And you can see how this idea of Switzerland keeps following us through. So first of all, let's look at the book of Numbers, chapter 10, verse 29, okay? Here, by the way, we see Moses said to Chovav, son of Reuel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law. It is not clear here whether Reuel is Moses' father-in-law or Chovav is Moses' father-in-law, but one of them is Jethro, okay? Because we know that Moses' father-in-law is Jethro, and it's the same family, it's the Midianite. So either Chovav or Reuel is Moses' father-in-law. But again, they're all in the same family. We are setting out for the place of which the Lord has said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we will be generous with you, for the Lord has promised to be generous with you. I will not go, he replied to him, but will return to my native land. Please, he said, please do not leave us, inasmuch as you know where we should camp in the wilderness and can be our guide. So if you come with us, we will extend to you the same boundary that the Lord grants us. So this is a conversation between Moses and his father-in-law, Jethro, or whatever you want to call him, saying, come with us into the land. They think at this point they're about to go right into the land of Israel. This is right before the sin of the spies. It's actually going to be another 38 years before they go. But in any case, he says, come with us, okay? And at the end of this conversation, it's not clear whether he joins them or not. It's kind of, Moses tries to convince him, and he doesn't really get a final answer, okay? Now, there is an indication later on that he does go back to Midian, okay? But on the other hand, there are indications that he does join the nation of Israel. Where are some of the places that we see that? So first of all, in our own book of Judges, we already read about these people. Judges chapter 1, verse 16. The descendants of Kenite, the father-in-law of Moses, went up with the Judites from the city of palms to the wilderness of Judah, and they went and settled among the people in the Negev of Arad, okay? So what we know is that, number one, they attached themselves to the tribe of Judah. They had been settling in Jericho, okay? Now, when were they in Jericho? Were they in Jericho after the destruction of Jericho and they came in? Probably. There's no indication that they were in Jericho before. The city of palms is Jericho. So they were there in that area after the Israelites conquered Jericho. It is destroyed. They camped there, okay, which is, again, very close to the camp. The Israelite camp is in Gilgal. Jericho is just across the Jordan. It's right near each other. And then we have them that they're, okay, now they're going to actually settle. They're, the conquest is over. It's time for them to settle. And where do they go? They settle in the south, in the tribe of Judah. They settle near Arad, okay? Now we look in chapter 4, which is where we are now, and we learn that in chapter 11, they separated themselves from the rest of the tribe. Where was the rest of the tribe? In the south, in Judah. This particular branch of the tribe, Hever's branch, went to the north and are in Naphtali. So we have two branches, okay? One in the north in Naphtali, part of that tribe, or with that tribe, and part in the south in the Negev, in the tribe of Judah. And then if we go and we look at 1 Samuel, chapter 15. chapter 15, verse 6. Okay, here we're talking about a time when Saul is about to conquer the Amalek. And he says as follows: Saul said to the Kenites. Now remember, we learned that the Kenites, the main branch of the family, was living in the south in the Negev. What do we learn here? They were living near the Amalekites, or whatever you call them. Saul said to the Kenites, "Come withdraw at once from among the Amalekites, that I may not destroy you along with them. For you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they left Egypt." So the Kenites withdrew from among the Amalekites. Okay, so we have a picture of the Kenites here who hang out both with Israel and with some of Israel's worst enemies. In 1 Samuel, we see they're hanging out with the Amalekites. And yet they retain a unique and separate identity. They retain their friendship with Israel, but it doesn't prevent them from also having friendship with Israel's enemies, the Amalekites, as we see in 1 Samuel. And here, the Canaanites who are, oppressing Israel. All of this is very important. Why? Okay, it's very important because what we see about Yael is that she is no Switzerland. Not at all. Look at how the story develops, okay? Verse 17, Sisera, meanwhile, had fled on foot to the tent of Yael, wife of Hever the Kenite, wife of Switzerland, the person who's neutral. For there was friendship between King Yavin and Chatzor and the family of Hever the Kenite, which means Sisera is confident that he will go to Yael and he will find refuge there. Yael came out to greet Sisera and said to him, "Come in, my lord, come in here, do not be afraid." So he entered her tent and she covered him with a blanket. He said to her, "Please let me have some water. I am thirsty." She opened a skin of milk and gave him some to drink, and she covered him again. He said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent. If anybody comes and asks you if there's anybody here, say no." Okay, so what we see here, if we look carefully at what Yael is doing, not only is she saying come in, but she is doing everything she can to create a sense of security, even intimacy with this man. She covers him with a blanket, okay? She gives him milk, not just water, milk. Milk, you have this idea of nurturing. A mother gives to her baby milk. She's nurturing Sisera by giving him milk, okay? And creates a sense of security in him. And she basically says, "Watch out for me, stand at the entrance of the tent." He trusts her to protect him. Here we have this big general trusting this woman to protect him. It's the woman in the tent, which is a classic picture of the woman, the household woman. Sarah is the woman in the tent. When she is about to be informed by the angel, she will become a mother. The woman in the tent is the mother, and he looks at her not only as the political ally, but as a nurturing figure who in this way can protect him. But what does she do instead? From that very same tent that he thinks is going to be his protection becomes his death. Then Yael, wife of Hever, and again we keep saying wife of Hever, wife of Hever. Why? Because even though she's the wife of Hever, she's going to be different from Hever. Hever is friendly with the Amalekites and he's friendly with the Canaanites. No, this wife of Hever is different. She took a tent pin and grasped the mallet when he was fast asleep from exhaustion. She approached him stealthily and drove the pin through his temple till it went down to the ground. Thus he died. She kills him. Totally unbelievable. Now Barak appeared in pursuit of Sisera. Yael went out to greet him and said, "Come, I will show you the man you are looking for." He went inside with her, and there Sisera was lying dead with the pin in his temple. On that day, God subdued King Yavin of Canaan before the Israelites. The hand of the Israelites bore harder and harder on King Yavin of Canaan until they destroyed King Yavin of Canaan. The way this is described here, we know from the verses before. We know about the blood, the mud, and the miracle. We don't have the details of the miracle. That comes later. But on the one hand, we are putting together the facts we learn in the song in chapter 5 with the facts we learn in chapter 4. On the other hand, it's also very important to keep them separate because they're two different versions of this story, each one with its own emphasis. Chapter 4 is God's story. Chapter 4 is the third person narrative coming from God, telling us this is what happened. Chapter 5 is Deborah's response, what she saw, what she understood, and what made the greatest impressions on her. It's her expression of praise and the victory and all that. But how does chapter 4 set it out? While yes, it's important to understand that the enemy is vanquished by some mysterious confusion that we learn about in verse 15, but how the end of the story is, it makes it very clear that as a result of Yael's brave act, driving the tent pin into Sisera's head, as a result of that, on that day, on which day? On that day that Yael killed Sisera, on that day that God subdued King Avin of Canaan, that her action was so critical. And I would suggest it's not just the fact that she killed Sisera. That's fine. I believe that what was so critical about her action was that she took a stand, that she refused, she rejected Switzerland, and she said, you can't be neutral. You're either with God's people or you're against God's people. You cannot be wishy-washy. And that's an amazing stand that she did, separating herself from her husband and from his whole clan. She was something different. And I think this is a message that's very important for us to take with us as we study the story, and particularly the way it's presented in chapter 4. So that's today's lesson. Again, happy to hear questions, comments from anybody. Oh, I like this question. Something like the Druze in Israel. I don't know if you realize the Druze see themselves as descendants of Jethro. So it's a very, very good comment. I would say, though, the Druze in Israel traditionally were really very much with Israel, okay? And the Druze, what they usually do is that they align themselves with whatever nation they are in. So they are loyal to the nation they are in. The Druze in Israel is different because today there's similarities, but today you have Druze who have really aligned with Israel, that are in the IDF, who have really give their lives for Israel and for the Jewish people. And then you have those who are wishy-washy, who are not quite sure. And then some of the younger generation is starting to identify more with the Palestinians, even though they are not Muslim. It's a very interesting comparison. Okay, anybody else? Questions, comments? Open your mics. I'd love to hear you.
Sandra, the Canaanites that were from Jethro, they were Midianites too, right? Midians.
The Jethro is originally a Midianite. The Canaanites are not. The Canaanites are Canaanites.
Right. So Jethro was originally a Midian. And isn't it that the Midianites came from Abraham, the wife after Sarah?
Yes.
So in a way,
a lot of people came from Abraham, and they weren't all so good.
Yeah. So in a way, you held to her original. She wanted to support.
That's a very good way of seeing it. Yeah. I would actually add something else, and I forgot, I meant to mention this earlier, but if you go back to Jethro, okay, Jethro himself is a bit wishy-washy, okay? Mm-hmm. Jethro himself is a priest of Midian. And actually, Jewish tradition says you'll see he was a priest of Midian, and then he comes to Moses and he praises God. He recognizes the miracles of the exodus from Egypt and the defeat of Amalek, and he's just full of wonder. But we saw in that conversation between Moses and Jethro, he's not quite sure where he stands. Is he going to join Moses? Is he not going to join Moses? In other words, we see that. There was a rabbi who analyzed all of that and characterized Jethro himself as somebody who was very interested in all different theologies. He was a priest of Midian. He wasn't just a guy, okay? He was a priest, and he was at a position, and the Midianites themselves were a fairly nomadic kind of group, okay? They attached themselves sometimes to the Moabites and sometimes to Amalek, and they attached themselves to different people. And in that context, he himself was one of these types, let's say a philosopher, he's exploring all the different ideas, not quite sure where he stands, okay? And so that kind of just adds to that whole thing. Anyone else? Yes, Jim, were you raising your hand, Jim? Okay. Anyone else? Okay, well, great to, oh, wait, Diane, you have something to say? Unmute yourself.
Okay.
Good, Diane, yes.
When I wrote an article about these two chapters a few years, well, quite a few years ago, and I was really thinking about JL, how she was in a society where she was totally under the control and rule of her husband, not agreeing with what he was doing, going back and forth, being, as you say, friends with everybody and being like Switzerland. And I was just imagining her driving a tent peg into the dry, hard ground, and all of her anger going into that motion of driving the tent peg in, because she had to be some strong woman to be able to drive a tent peg into a man's temple and pin him to the ground.
Right, no question, but for sure, she was strong, she was determined, incredible courage, courage, no question.
Yeah.
Lynn, I see you have a question.
Yes, I might have missed it. Verse 523. Who was Meroz? Meroz, please.
Wait, can you say that again? I had trouble hearing you. Can you speak a little louder?
Judges 5:23.
Yeah.
And who's that who's being cursed?
You're
Please.
talking about chapter 5 and how the same thing is described in chapter 5.
No, in verse 23, it names it, because my version, obviously my version's very different.
Wait, verse 23 in which chapter?
Chapter
Five.
5. She's wanting to know who the name is because we're not recognizing the name in English.
Chapter 5, verse 23?
Yeah.
Oru Meroz.
Oh, Meroz.
Yes, please.
Yeah, Meroz. It's not somebody's name. I
Oh.
believe it's like it's an expression, you know. I think it's talking about some heavenly force. It's not like a name of a person. Curse Meroz of the angel of the Lord. Okay, I think it's referring to cursing some force of evil.
Oh, because here it says, Rashi says that it was a name of a prominent person or a city, but it was Radak,
Right, let me
located
take
near
a
the
look.
battlefield that did not join Barak's cause.
Okay, let me see
That was
what
Rashi
it
and
says
Radak.
here. Well, Rashi says it was like a star, or it could be an important person. He brings both possibilities. Star being like that's what I was referring to, like a heavenly power, you know. But in any case, it's not meant to be literally an individual that we're dealing with, but an expression of, you know, curse that who will try to stand against us.
But that was a strong curse.
Oh yeah. Well, she was quite. We're gonna, you know, do some of this. You know, we're gonna go through the song next week. And talk about some of the things that she talks about. She is no meek lady, this Deborah. No meek lady, and she stands very strongly. She stands and criticizes those people who don't join the fight. She praises those who do. She praises Yael. She praises herself. Okay, she's quite an interesting woman. Okay, is there anybody else with a question or a comment?
No,
Okay, so have a wonderful week. Oh, wait, Derek, I see you raised your hand.
Back to verse 2 in chapter 5.
Okay.
You were translating directly from the Hebrew.
Right.
Because you found the English wasn't very helpful.
Well, it didn't make sense to me. In my English, it said, when locks go untrimmed. What does that mean?
Yeah, exactly. In my version, I've got, which is the new NIV UK.
Yeah.
When the princes in Israel take the lead, when the people willingly offer themselves, praise the Lord.
Yeah, heat and death.
Okay, the second thing makes sense, but the beginning, it makes no sense. And I'll tell you something else. Verse 2, the first 3 words, okay, is exactly the same words as, no, excuse me. That was a different one that I didn't like.
Anyway, what I wanted to mention or to ask you was, you said the Hebrew means volunteers.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
When the people
what
volunteered.
you read was the people offered themselves. Okay.
When the people willingly offer themselves.
Yeah. So the word
is that a
willing,
good? Is that a good translation of the voluntary?
Yeah. In other words, the willingly offered themselves is a translation of the word in Hebrew, which is hitnadev, which means volunteer. Okay. What in my translation, the word in verse 2, it says when people dedicate themselves. And then in verse,
it doesn't express the same thing, does it?
No, it's not the same. And I'll tell you something else, that's the one that repeats itself later. That made absolutely no sense. I'm just trying to find where it is.
Verse 9.
Oh yes.
Verse 9,
Netwood.
exactly. In verse 9, it takes the same words, okay, in Hebrew, and translates it with the dedicated of the people. Okay, so you're either dedicated or, it's also dedicate yourself. I don't know. Dedicated. It has nothing to do with it. It's about volunteering.
In my version, my heart is with Israel's princes, with the willing volunteers among the people.
Yeah.
And
but the beginning doesn't make any sense.
I like
the beginning is about the word in Hebrew is bifra praot, and praot always means either something wild or something violent. Okay, that's the word. So it's like when or oppression. Okay, so when there was violent oppression against Israel, that's what it means. I don't understand what this locks going trimmed is.
yeah.
Is that like a Nazarite?
Yeah, I don't know. It could be, but I don't think it's talking about somebody's hair.
Or when they volunteer for the military, maybe they don't have time to get a haircut.
Also, keep in mind that she then afterwards talks about in verse 6, in the days of Shamgar, son of Anat, in the days of Yael, caravans ceased, wayfarers went by roundabout paths. She is describing a time of oppression. And so it's that same time that's described in verse 2, at a time of oppression and violence against Israel. Then people volunteered. I mean, it makes sense, you know. They were having trouble, and people volunteered to solve the problem.
Yeah. What I like about the word willing in English is so often you get this emphasis in the scriptures. The Lord loves someone who's willing, who gives from the heart.
Absolutely. And willing, volunteering, it's all the same thing. They're donating. They're giving of themselves. No one's drafting them. They're giving of themselves. And this is a very important message that she's giving here. Okay. Well, we had a nice conversation. So thank you all for joining us. And please God, we will meet again next week, and we will do chapter 5 and hopefully finally finish the story of Deborah.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sondra.
Nice being here.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.